In September 1941, in anticipation of our entry into World War II, Congress passed Public Law 77-252, which authorized President Franklin Roosevelt to make temporary appointments of persons as commissioned officers in the Army for the duration of an emergency and 6 months thereafter. Women were not defined as persons. So, when at the beginning of World War II there were not enough male pilots in the United States Army Air Force to fly stateside and fly combat, the Army reconsidered a proposal made by Jackie Cochran to Eleanor Roosevelt and later to General Hap Arnold to employ women to ferry planes stateside. Meanwhile, Cochran and 25 women recruits left to volunteer for the Air Transport Auxiliary in England. In her absence, Brigadier General William Tunner established the Women's Auxiliary Ferry Squadron, headed by Nancy Harkness Love.
Nancy Love started this WASP thing. First we were WASPs. Nancy Love was a pilot. And she was a New England girl, very soft-voiced, very polished New England girl.
It went into operation September 10th, 1942. Cochran returned from England the same day and confronted Arnold, who on September 15th authorized the Women's Flying Training Detachment under the command of Cochran. Love had trained pilots and focused mainly on ferrying planes, while Cochran was clearly interested in having women militarized and equal to men. In the summer of 1943, Cochran pushed for a single entity, and Arnold combined the two under Cochran. It became known as the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs, but they were classified as civilian employees. Some 25,000 women applied for the program, 1,830 entered the program, and 1,074 completed it. However, their qualifications and training paralleled or were higher than their male counterparts. Women had to be U.S. citizens between the ages of 18.5 and 35, have a high school diploma, and 2 character references. Their training program mirrored that of the United States Army Air Force cadets. They studied physics and math, learned military law, courtesy in arms, aerobatics and formation flying, put in 30 hours instrument flying, and a great deal of calisthenics and drill. When training was completed, they flew 77 different types of aircraft over 60 million miles. Duties included target towing, radar calibration, smoke laying, engine and maintenance testing, flying as co-pilots at training facilities, providing transportation for supplies and personnel, simulated strafing, night tracking missions, flying drones, and flying the B-29 Superfortress to prove to the male pilots that they were safe to fly.
I thought if I could train those 2 girls to fly, nobody had to say anything. Put those guys in the airplane with them and let them do the routine that I taught them to do.
Then in 1995, I received a letter that really amazed me. I couldn't believe it. The man who wrote it said, "I realize that it was a long time ago, but I still want to thank you for helping me that day at Clovis. You came to show us that the B-29 plane was not one to be feared. You were the pilot that day and demonstrated your excellent flying skills and convinced us the B-29 was a plane that any pilot would be proud to fly."
Their pay, however, was 14% below that of a second lieutenant and 35% below their male counterparts in the ferrying division. While training at Avenger Field in Texas, they had no crash truck, no fire truck, and a minimal administrative staff. 38 WASPs died in the line of duty. They received neither health nor death benefits, and families were expected to foot the bill for both. By mid-1943, Cochran was lobbying Congress for militarization, but by 1944, the war was winding down, and many pilots who had flown in Europe were returning home, only to be potentially drafted as foot soldiers into the Pacific Theater. They wanted the jobs held by WASPs.
I think the girls knew we were all being watched. Every guy, every pilot, everything male was watching us, you know, because a lot of them resented the fact that we were ferrying too, so they loved to turn in a report if they saw you doing something wrong.
A political campaign waged by a powerful male civilian pilots lobby against militarization defeated the bill in the House. The existing culture in the 1940s which had already been weakened by the Great Depression, was not prepared for women to succeed in male-dominated roles, particularly in one that had historically been a proving ground for masculinity. 8 months before the end of the war, Arnold deactivated the unit. Their files were classified for 35 years, and their history relegated to obscurity. Ignorance and fear had won the debate. So, imagine their surprise when in 1976, the Air Force announced they were training the first women to fly for the military. Surviving WASPs and other supporters quickly organized, and with the support of Senator Barry Goldwater, who himself had been a ferry pilot with the 27th Squadron, and Congresswomen Lindy Boggs and Margaret Heckler, introduced H.R. 5087 to grant WASPs veteran status and attached it as a rider to a veterans education bill.
Barry also was a pilot in the Ferry Command, as I was. He was stationed in Wilmington, Delaware, and I was stationed in Long Beach, California, and one day we met. I'd never been to Arizona except to land at Sky Harbor for refueling, but we met in Dallas. We were both weathered in. He was flying a plane from a factory to the West Coast. I was flying one from a factory to the East Coast, and we were stuck in, so we had a cup of coffee together. I think Barry Goldwater pushed hard to get us militarized because I think he felt that we were doing a very good job, doing the same job that he was doing, and we didn't have any of the perks that went along with it, so he really pushed in Washington to see that we got the same retirement pay and things that he got.
The debate was fierce, with most of the opposition coming from the Veterans Administration and the Veterans of Foreign Wars, both male-dominated organizations. In 1944, the debate was whether women should be allowed to perform military missions, and it was about male privilege, the right to receive flight pay, and to avoid the draft. The worth of women was debated. Unlike 1944, when WASPs were not allowed to tell their stories to the media, in 1977, they waged a very public media campaign, at a time when the roles of women were changing. Opponents testified that WASPs had received civil service benefits, which they had not. Some veterans cited the U.S. Code, which defined a veteran as a person who has served in the active military, naval, or air service, and who was discharged or released therefrom under conditions other than dishonorable, as evidence that women could not be veterans. Bird Howell Granger, a former WASP and University of Arizona professor, compiled documentation to prove that WASPs deserved militarization. She provided sets of orders for 2 WASPs to fly in combat zones of the Caribbean, evidence that women were told initially that they would be militarized, and a set of official discharge papers issued to Helen B. Porter, identical to those given to soldiers. Even though the Veterans Administration and President Carter opposed the bill, it passed and was signed into law November 23, 1977, proving once again that diplomacy is more successful than the single-minded assertiveness pursued by Cochrane 35 years before. In 1979, the Air Force granted individual WASPs discharge papers, making military service official. Today, WASPs can go to veterans' hospitals. They receive a small pension. Their families can display gold stars in their windows. They can be interned in Arlington National Cemetery if cremated, a star placed on their grave, and their coffins can be covered with the American flag. But most of all, they will be remembered for being pioneering women in the field of aviation. They proved that gender is an artificial construction that need not subjugate women. Their history is silent no more.